It began like any other night. A cold December evening in Chicago, just days after Christmas. The streets still glittered with holiday lights, store windows still dressed in red and gold. People were out, shopping, laughing, breathing in the last days of the year. Barbara and Patricia Grimes were just two teenage girls heading to the movies. They'd done it dozens of times before. The neighborhood theater was only a short walk from home. They were going to see Elvis Presley, Love Me Tender, for the second time. They had a few coins in their pockets. Their mother told them not to stay out too late, and that was it. They left. The walk was familiar. Sidewalks they'd walked 100 times. Street lights flickering overhead. Other kids heading the same way. Nothing strange, nothing out of place, nothing to warn what was coming. They bought their tickets. They found their seats. The film began. And that's where the trail ends, because after the credits rolled, no one saw them again. Not walking home, not boarding a bus, not calling for help, nothing. The theater emptied, the city moved on, and by morning, the world had changed. It would be weeks before anyone found answers, but by then, the damage had already been done. This is Night Echo, 4 true stories every week, told slowly and completely. Subscribe if you haven't already. Now, keep the lights low and listen closely, because what started as a simple trip to the movies became one of the most haunting mysteries Chicago has ever known. Chicago, 1956. It was the final days of December, and the holidays had cast their usual glow over the city. Shop windows were still decorated with tinsel and blinking lights. Snow clung to sidewalks like an afterthought. And in the suburb of McKinley Park, the streets were quiet, just as they always were after Christmas. Barbara and Patricia Grimes weren't planning anything extraordinary that night, just a simple trip to the movies. A routine they had followed countless times before. They were sisters, close in age, closer in bond. Barbara was 15, Patricia just 13. In a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, they were familiar faces. The kind of girls who always walked together, talked together, laughed together. It was Friday, December 28th. The plan was simple. Catch the 7:30 showing of Love Me Tender at the Brighton Theater, just a few blocks from home. Elvis Presley was everything to them, Patricia especially. She had already seen the movie over a dozen times, but it didn't matter. For teenage girls in 1956, Elvis wasn't just a singer, he was a movement, a dream. They left the house around 7:15, dressed neatly in wool coats, $1.50 between them. No one worried, no one thought twice. It was the kind of outing that required no questions. But it was also the last time anyone saw them alive. What followed in the days, weeks, and months after their disappearance would grip the entire city in fear and confusion. Their case would become one of the largest missing persons investigations in Chicago history. And still, it would end with more questions than answers. But on that cold December night, none of that had happened yet. The Grimes sisters simply walked down their street, chatting about Elvis and the movie, the snow crunching beneath their shoes. They reached the theater on time. The cashier remembered them. They paid for 2 tickets and entered the lobby with a small crowd of other teens. But what happened after that is where the mystery begins. Some witnesses would later claim they saw the girls inside the theater, laughing, watching the screen, sitting near the front. Others insisted they left early. One boy swore he saw them getting into a car outside. Another said he spotted them at a nearby diner later that night. Still others claimed they were hitchhiking along the road. Too many accounts, too many contradictions. What is known for certain is that Barbara and Patricia never made it home that night. When the movie ended, their mother, Loretta, began to worry. It wasn't like them to be late, not without calling. She waited a little longer. Midnight passed, then 1 in the morning. By 2, she called the police. What began as a missing persons report quickly escalated into something far bigger. By the next day, the news had spread across the city. 2 young sisters gone without a trace, no signs of a struggle, no known enemies, no logical explanation. The investigation exploded. Over 300,000 flyers were distributed. Police combed the area on foot, horseback, even helicopters, canvassing door to door, interviewing neighbors, following every possible lead. And the sightings kept coming in, dozens of them. The girls were reportedly seen boarding a bus in Cicero, at a skating rink in Indiana, inside a hotel in Nashville, walking down roads hundreds of miles apart, always together, always silent. But every lead went cold. Every witness contradicted the next, and none of it made sense. The press had a field day. Papers ran headlines daily. Reporters hounded the family. Loretta pleaded for privacy, but also for help. Her voice on the radio, asking her daughters to come home, promising they wouldn't be punished, begging anyone who saw them to speak up. But the phone never rang with the call she needed, just static and silence. The first few days after Barbara and Patricia Grimes vanished felt like someone had hit pause on the normal rhythm of the neighborhood. People still went to work. School buses still rumbled down the block. Radio still played Elvis Presley's Love Me Tender on the hour, every hour. But underneath it all, something was off, like the city was holding its breath, waiting for something that never came. By Saturday morning, it had been over 24 hours since anyone had seen the Grimes girls. Loretta hadn't slept, not really. She'd drift off in a chair now and then, but her eyes never seemed to stay closed. She'd already called every friend she could think of, visited the theater, driven along Archer Avenue half a dozen times. Still, no Barbara, no Patricia. She made another call to the police. This time, they listened. The initial theory had been simple. 2 teenagers out late, probably ran off with friends or a couple of boys. They'll be back when they're hungry. But Loretta knew her daughters. They wouldn't have run off, and they wouldn't have ignored her voice on the answering machine, begging them to call. Something wasn't right. By the afternoon, the Chicago Police Department officially opened a missing persons case. That evening, WGN Radio broke the news. 2 Chicago sisters aged 13 and 15 missing since December 28th after seeing an Elvis film. That was all it took. The calls started coming in. Dozens at first, then hundreds. One man said he'd seen 2 girls fitting their description at a local diner in Cicero. A waitress swore they'd been in her booth on New Year's Eve. Another caller, this one from Indiana, claimed the girls had hitched a ride to Nashville. One woman insisted she saw them walking into a hotel in Memphis, their arms linked, giggling. The stories were vivid, detailed, convincing, but none of them matched. For every witness who placed them downtown, another placed them near the lake, or in a drugstore on the south side, or boarding a Greyhound. Theories spun up like dust devils. They'd run away to meet Elvis. They were escaping a troubled home life. They were rebelling. The problem was, none of those things were true. Barbara and Patricia had been happy. No signs of trouble at school, no secret boyfriends, no diary entries filled with escape fantasies. They'd gone to see a movie and never come home. By Monday, January 7th, the story had gone national. The FBI stepped in. The girls' photos were printed on milk cartons, slipped into mailboxes, taped to telephone poles. Volunteers canvassed theaters, diners, and parking lots. More than 15,000 people were interviewed. Police opened over 300 reported sightings. Every one of them led nowhere. Loretta refused to stop hoping. She stood at the kitchen table day after day, answering calls from strangers, reporters, and supposed psychics. Some callers kind, others cruel. A few told her the girls were dead. One said they'd been taken by a cult. One woman even mailed Loretta a map with 2 red X's marked grave. Loretta kept them all, just in case. Somewhere along the way, something strange began to happen. The story of Barbara and Patricia started to split in two. There was the official investigation, where detectives reviewed reports, filed statements, and dismissed false leads. Then there was the public version, fueled by rumor, whispered at bus stops, passed across pews at Sunday Mass. In the official version, the Grimes girls were still missing. In the public version, they had become everything from runaways to ghosts. But then something changed. A man named Edward Benny Bedwell walked into the picture. He was 21 years old, a drifter, worked odd jobs in and around Chicago, thin, scruffy, with wild hair and a slow drawl. He bore a striking resemblance to Elvis Presley. When he was brought in for questioning, Benny told a strange story. He claimed he'd seen Barbara and Patricia in the company of another man named Frank. They'd all gone to a bar, then to a house on the west side. There had been drinking, dancing. At one point, Benny claimed the girls told him their mother didn't care what they did. Then, just as suddenly, he changed his story. Now he said the girls had stayed with them for over a week, that they had left on their own, that maybe they'd headed south. The details shifted with every retelling. One minute he was with them, the next he wasn't. One version placed them in Indiana, another in a Chicago flophouse. None of it made sense, but the public latched onto it. It was something, a lead, a name. And when Benny Bedwell was arrested, people thought the case was finally breaking open, but it wasn't. His confession didn't line up. The timeline was wrong. No evidence backed it up. Eventually, it came out that he'd been coerced, kept in custody for days, fed information, pressured into talking. He was released weeks later. Just like that, the lead fell apart. As the days dragged on, so did the fear. By mid-January, the tone in the neighborhood had shifted. Doors were locked earlier. Parents walked their kids to school. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. The Grimes family couldn't go outside without reporters circling. Loretta, exhausted and haunted, stopped answering the phone. And still, the girls were missing. Weeks turned into a month. Posters began to peel from walls. The public moved on, but the Grimes family didn't. Not for 1 second. Then, on January 22nd, nearly a full month after the girls vanished, a phone call came into the Cook County Sheriff's Office. A man named Leonard Prescott had seen something near a desolate stretch of road in Lyons Township, just off German Church Road, south of Chicago. Two shapes, side by side, pale, motionless. Deputies were dispatched, and what they found would end the search. By the third week of January 1957, the city of Chicago was no longer just concerned. It was afraid. What had begun as a missing persons case had transformed into something far darker and more confusing. The disappearance of Barbara and Patricia Grimes had gone from a family's private heartbreak to a civic mystery unfolding on the front pages and radio waves. The police investigation had widened its scope dramatically. Dozens of officers were assigned full-time. Every tip, no matter how small or strange, was written down. Canvassing efforts expanded well beyond the McKinley Park neighborhood. Forest preserves, empty buildings, even drainage tunnels were searched. Detectives were seen pacing through alleys, interviewing bus drivers, cinema ushers, shopkeepers, and anyone who might have seen the girls that night. But the problem wasn't a lack of information, it was the opposite. Leads came in by the hundreds, each one contradicting the next. Some witnesses swore they had seen the girls the morning after they vanished, alive and laughing. Others claimed they had been seen in distant suburbs, with a man without a man boarding a bus or walking into a diner. Some tips came from psychics. Some were anonymous letters. None of them led anywhere. At one point, a woman in Nashville claimed the girls had been in her restaurant. Another woman in Indiana insisted she'd seen Barbara and Patricia in a car with two boys heading south. Police followed every trail, every bus ticket, every diner check stub. The reports always ended the same. The girls were not there. The Grimes family, already devastated, was caught in a web of hope and disappointment. Loretta Grimes, their mother, stayed by the phone. She refused to change the girls' bedroom, refused to let their laundry be touched. She believed they were alive. She believed they had been taken. And she believed someone was covering something up. But the longer the case stretched on, the stranger the public response became. Young girls began reporting sightings of Patricia and Barbara at their schools. Boys claimed they had spoken to them downtown. A local radio DJ even announced a $1,000 reward for information, fueling even more calls and false sightings. Soon, the investigation took on a bizarre life of its own. An older woman claimed she had seen a spirit of the girls near a church. A janitor at a school claimed to have found a clue in the girls' handwriting scrawled on a bathroom wall. Police, now desperate, entertained them all. Meanwhile, the press continued to run daily updates, though facts were increasingly scarce. The case had gone national. Reporters from New York and California wrote about the Grimes sisters. Their smiling faces, taken from school portraits, were printed again and again, always side by side, always under the same question. Where are Barbara and Patricia? But the truth was, the case was slipping away. The longer the girls remained missing, the less likely it seemed they would be found alive. Though no one said it out loud, not at first. People had started to expect the worst. Still, without bodies, there was room to hope. And so the search continued. Then came the freezing cold morning of January 22nd, 1957, 26 days after the girls were last seen. A man named Leonard Prescott, a construction worker, was driving along German Church Road in unincorporated Willow Springs just outside Chicago. The road was surrounded by brush and ditches, mostly used by locals. Prescott noticed something strange as he passed a section of the road near a rural turnout. In the distance, something pale caught his eye, just beyond a guardrail down an embankment. At first, he thought it was a pair of mannequins discarded in the cold, but something about the way they lay made him stop. He returned later with his wife, and then he called the police. What they had seen were not mannequins. The bodies of two young girls were lying just off the side of the road, partially covered in snow. Their coats were missing. Their hands were bare. They were laid out, side by side, almost as if they had been placed there. The position was strange. It did not look like they had fallen. It did not look like they had been dragged. Their skin, though cold and pale, showed no immediate signs of wounds or violence. Their hair was neat, their faces peaceful. The police arrived quickly, but the scene was already compromised. Locals had gathered, news reporters had arrived before the area was fully secured. Footprints were trampled, tire tracks were disrupted, evidence lost. Still, what remained was undeniable. Barbara and Patricia Grimes had been found, but their condition raised more questions than it answered. There were no visible signs of struggle, no stab wounds, no gunshots, no ligature marks, no bruises that could explain what had happened. Autopsies were ordered immediately. The bodies were taken to the Cook County morgue. But what the coroners found only deepened the mystery. Though the cold had preserved the girls' bodies to some extent, it also complicated the examination. The estimated time of death was inconsistent. Some reports said they had died within hours of disappearing. Others suggested they had survived for days. In the end, the official conclusion was vague and troubling. The cause of death could not be determined with certainty. Barbara had traces of alcohol in her system. Patricia did not. There were small abrasions, faint bruises, but nothing that could clearly explain how they had died. One coroner believed they had died from shock or exposure, another suspected suffocation. A third was convinced the bodies had been kept elsewhere, possibly refrigerated, and placed in the ditch after death. The manner of their deaths, the lack of injuries, and the strange condition of their bodies left investigators with more confusion than clarity. Who would abduct two young girls and then leave their bodies in plain sight without any clear signs of violence? Why were their coats and belongings missing? And why would someone go to the trouble of preserving their appearance only to dump them on a roadside weeks later? Public reaction was immediate and explosive. The press ran wild with theories. The police were criticized for mishandling the scene. Rumors of cover-ups and incompetence began to circulate, but behind the noise, the facts were few. The Grimes sisters were gone. Their family was shattered, and the truth was still out there, buried under snow, silence, and a case that was only growing colder. For weeks, their names lingered in newspaper headlines, accompanied by grainy photos and echoing questions no one could answer. Barbara and Patricia Grimes, gone without a trace. Then found, but not found whole, not found with peace. Now the investigation stood still. There was no clear cause of death, no suspect in custody, no motive that made sense, and no direction for the public to follow except backward, into fear, into rumor, into theory. Because when facts grow quiet, stories take over. And in this case, the stories never stopped. Some of the earliest suspicions revolved around the location where the girls were found. German Church Road, a secluded stretch in Willow Springs, far from the lights of Chicago, far from where two teenage girls might have wandered on their own. It wasn't just that it was remote. It was the kind of place you had to know to reach. A back road known to locals and, some whispered, to men who didn't want to be seen. One theory was simple. They had been killed elsewhere, then left there deliberately, dumped like evidence, displayed just out of reach. But that raised its own questions. Why that road? Why that field? And how did they end up in the exact spot a man just happened to see from his truck cab that morning? It felt staged. Others focused on the autopsy, or what little was revealed from it. The official findings were vague. Hypothermia, perhaps. No signs of trauma, but also no explanation for why their bodies showed signs of preservation, despite lying in the cold for weeks. The coroner's timeline didn't match the weather reports. Their stomach contents didn't match their last known meals. And their skin showed less exposure than it should have for girls left out in a field for nearly a month. Whispers followed. Had the girls really died that same night? Or had they been kept somewhere, hidden, alive, for a while? There were also the sightings, dozens of them. In the days after their disappearance, people claimed to see Barbara and Patricia in diners, on buses and theaters. Some insisted they were seen with older men. One woman swore she served them breakfast in Indiana. A taxi driver claimed he picked them up and dropped them near a park. The police chased these leads. They interviewed witnesses, but nothing stuck. Still, the volume of the sightings raised questions. Could they all be wrong? Or were the girls moving before they stopped? The most infamous theory came from a man who inserted himself into the case early on, Edward Benny Bedwell. A 21-year-old drifter from Tennessee, Bedwell bore a striking resemblance to Elvis Presley, enough to attract attention in mid-century America. He was working odd jobs, washing dishes, sleeping in cheap rooms, moving from place to place. And then he confessed. He told police he and a friend had been drinking with two girls who fit Barbara and Patricia's description. Said they had hung out together for days, visiting bars and cheap motels. He said they died accidentally after a night that turned violent, that they'd panicked, hid the bodies, left town. But the confession didn't match the timeline. It didn't match the autopsy. And it didn't match the details that investigators hadn't released to the public. Within days, he recanted. He claimed he'd been pressured, threatened, told what to say, that the police wanted a story. So he gave them one. The charges were dropped, but the damage lingered. Others suspected organized crime. Chicago in the 1950s wasn't just a city of diners and drive-ins. It was a city ruled by shadows, mobsters, racketeers, and people who knew how to make things, and people disappear. Some believed the girls had seen something they shouldn't. Others thought they were taken as part of something darker. But those theories, too, dissolved under scrutiny. There was no evidence, no names, no link, only suggestion, only fear. Then came the more personal theories. People looked inward, at teachers, neighbors, classmates. There was a bus driver who drove the route the girls might have taken, a man with a quiet past and a house not far from where the bodies were found. There was a boy who had once asked Barbara out, angrily refused. He was questioned, then cleared. Even their own family wasn't spared. For a moment, suspicion turned toward their father, a grieving man, a quiet man, a man who seemed composed during interviews, who didn't cry on cue. It was baseless, but the media ran with it. In time, the theories stacked up like bricks in a wall, not one solid enough to stand on its own, but together enough to block the light. The Grimes case became an echo chamber in 1957, then in 1965, 1974, 1988, 1996. Journalists would reopen the file. True crime authors would write new chapters. TV specials would revive the photos, the theories, the doubts. But never the answers, because the truth, if it ever existed in one place, was lost in the noise. And then came something stranger, something quieter, something almost folkloric. Some said the girls were still seen, ghosts at the corner of 3rd by 5th Street, whispers in the alley behind the theater, figures walking hand in hand along the edge of Archer Avenue before vanishing behind streetlights. Not real sightings, but memories that refuse to fade. Grief turned into story. Story turned into haunting. Because the scariest part of a mystery isn't just what happened. It's that it keeps happening in the minds of those who remember. The Grimes case wasn't cold. It was frozen, suspended in time, and that's where it remained until something else thawed it loose. Decades passed, but the case never really left. It sat in drawers, whispered through newsrooms, referenced in police classrooms as a lesson in what not to let slip away. Every so often, a retired detective would mention it. A new article would bring the photos back, and someone, always someone, would ask, why haven't they solved it? There were still files, still fingerprints, still boxes with papers browned at the edges full of names that no longer meant anything. Even the coroner's report, so carefully worded, felt more like a question than an answer. In 2013, a retired investigator claimed to know the truth. He said a man confessed to him years ago. Said he picked the girls up that night. Said he panicked when one resisted. Said he didn't mean for them to die, but that man was gone, dead. And so was the detective who said he heard the story. There was no recording, no written report, just a claim. Too late to prove, and still Chicago remembers. The theater where they were last seen, it's gone now. The corner they stood on, rebuilt, the old roads repaved, but the story lingers. Barbara and Patricia. Not a headline, not a myth, just two sisters who went out to see a movie and never came home. Their graves are quiet now, but every so often flowers still appear. No note, no name, just a silent acknowledgement they are not forgotten. And maybe that's the only justice they'll ever have. They were just two girls heading out to see a movie, a December night, a city they trusted, and somewhere along the way, that trust was broken. What happened to Barbara and Patricia Grimes remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in Chicago's history. Not because it's the only one, but because of how quickly it slipped away and how long the silence lasted after. Sometimes it's not the horror that stays with us, it's the absence, the gaps between what we know and what we never will. If this story stayed with you, if it haunted you the way it's haunted this city for decades, subscribe to Night Echo for more true stories told slowly and completely. We bring you 4 new mysteries every week, always real, always chilling, always faceless. And before you go, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? U.S., UK, Canada, Australia, or somewhere colder, quieter, stranger? Drop it below. Let's see where the echo reaches. Like the video, share it with someone who walks the dark roads with us. And don't forget, some stories never rest. Not in daylight, not in death, and not in memory. Until next time, keep your lights low and your ears open, because the past doesn't stay buried forever.